Shortly before midnight on April 14, 1912, the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg somewhere in the North Atlantic Ocean. Over the next few hours, the ship would gradually sink before finally plunging into the water, landing on the ocean floor where it remains today. Around half of the people on board for what was her maiden voyage died. The tragedy made headlines around the world and helped change maritime laws and regulations. From as far back as 1912, the story of the Titanic has interested the public and has continuously had a presence in popular culture. Even today, the Titanic is still arguably the most famous ship in the world, with many people being familiar with movies and other stories based on it. But what actually happened with the real ship in real life? What's up guys, Freindlyneighborhoodpig here, and in this video we're going to be covering almost everything about the Titanic. Be sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out some of the other videos on my channel as well. Thanks guys, and now let's get into the video. In order to fully understand the Titanic, it's important to know a little bit about the shipping industry of the late 19th and early 20th century, which was highly competitive, particularly in the North Atlantic, where some of the world's largest shipping companies fought for dominance of the route and competed against each other to try and make the biggest, fastest, and overall best ships. Before talking about this though, we can go back even further to the founding of the White Star Line. White Star Line was a British shipping company originally founded in 1845 by John Picklington and Henry Wilson. Over the course of its history, the company would launch many well-known ships, most famously the Titanic. In its early days, White Star Line chartered smaller ships, mostly servicing the route from the UK to Australia, which was growing in popularity at the time due to the recent discovery of gold there. They sailed ships across the Atlantic too. To finance their operations, White Star Line mainly borrowed money from the Bank of Liverpool. When the bank failed, White Star Line was left with an enormous amount of debt, and in 1867 they went bankrupt. Thomas Ismay bought the bankrupt company for £1,000. Ismay planned on focusing more on the route between Liverpool and New York City. In 1869, Liverpool financier Gustav Christian Schwab agreed to finance Ismay's new ships as long as he ordered them from his nephew's shipping company, Harland & Wolff. A deal was made, and Harland & Wolff would go on to make the majority of White Star Line's ships. In 1870, the first ship since Ismay purchased the company, the Oceanic, was launched. At 420 feet long and 3,707 tons, with the capacity for 166 first-class passengers and around 1,000 third-class, with innovative and luxurious accommodations, the ship was described in newspapers as an imperial yacht. Her maiden voyage began on March 2, 1871, but shortly after leaving Liverpool, the ship began having engine problems and had to turn around. The voyage resumed on March 16th, and from that point, the Oceanic was a success for White Star Line. Soon, sister ships were built. They were the Atlantic, Baltic, and the Republic, then the Adriatic and the Celtic. These ships all proved to be successful. In 1872, the Adriatic won the highly sought-after Blue Riband, which was awarded to the fastest passenger ship to cross the Atlantic. On March 20th, 1873, the Atlantic left for her 19th voyage from Liverpool to New York, carrying almost 1,000 passengers. Due to bad weather conditions, the ship went slower than expected, leading some to wonder if they had enough coal to make it to New York. Captain James Williams decided to stop at Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Canada to get more supplies. In the early morning hours of April 1st, the Atlantic hit a rock off the coast of Nova Scotia and sank. Approximately 550 people died in what was one of the worst civilian maritime disasters at the time. Due to the loss of the Atlantic, White Star Line sold two of its less profitable ships, the Tropic and the Asiatic. Both ships hadn't been with the company long and serviced places in India and in South America. Despite the negative publicity surrounding the Atlantic, White Star Line continued to produce popular ships, mostly for the Liverpool to New York route. Notable ships during this time are the Britannic and her sister ship, the Germanic, both launched in 1874, although Germanic didn't have her maiden voyage until May 1875. Speed was still an important factor when these ships were built, and they both did win the Blue Riband eventually. Due to the addition of 2 new ships, White Star Line decided they didn't need the Oceanic on the North Atlantic route anymore. A deal was made to charter her to the Occidental and Oriental Steamship Company, where she would serve the route from Hong Kong and San Francisco, stopping in Yokohama, Japan along the way. White Star Line would also supply the Occidental and Oriental Shipping Company with 2 more ships, the Gaelic and the Belgic. Later, 4 more ships were supplied, the Arabic and the Coptic, along with new ships that were also named the Gaelic and the Belgic. It was also around this time that White Star Line made a deal to carry mail on board its ships, meaning the names of their ships would now be able to start with RMS, which stood for Royal Mail Ship. More notable ships that were released, and the last White Star Line ships to win the Blue Ribbon, were the Titanic and the Majestic, both launched in 1889. For a period of time, the Majestic was captained by Edward Smith, who would later be the captain of the Titanic on her maiden voyage. By this point, many of White Star Line's ships were beginning to become dated and started to be surpassed by new ships put out by competing companies. For their next couple of ships, a decision was made to focus on quality and comfort of the accommodations on board instead of competing for a blue ribbon. One of these ships built for this purpose was the Oceanic. Launched in 1899, named after the original Oceanic from 1870, she was the largest ship in the world until 1901. Like the first Oceanic, this new ship was also a success. A sister ship called the Olympic was planned, but following the death of Thomas Ismay on November 23, 1899, the project was cancelled, though the name Olympic will later be used for another White Star Line ship. Thomas Ismay was succeeded by his son, J. Bruce Ismay. In 1902, the company was bought by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company. Morgan had also purchased other shipping companies in an attempt to have a monopoly on the industry. Being an American, J.P. Morgan could not directly own British ships, but he was able to own the company that owned the ships, therefore indirectly owning them. Bruce Ismay kept his job at White Star Line, and in 1904, also became president of the IMM. For the most part, White Star Line's main competition was other British companies, notably ones like the Inman Line and the Cunard Line. But in the late 1890s, German ships began to be more competitive. In September 1897, the ship Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse from the German shipping company Norddeutscher Lloyd had its maiden voyage. It was one of the largest and fastest ships of the time, and also profited by transporting passengers, primarily immigrants, from Europe to the United States. Another German ship, the SS Deutschland of the Hamburg America Line, was launched in 1900. These ships were very successful and had both won the Blue Ribbon. The Deutschland had won in 1900 to 1902 when it lost to Norddeutscher Lloyd's Kronprinz Wilhelm for the westbound record before winning again in 1903. From 1901 to 1907, White Star Line introduced 4 new ships known as the Big Four. They were the Celtic, Cedric, Baltic, and Adriatic. Like their previous ship, the Big Four were built prioritizing luxury and size over speed. The Adriatic was the first ocean liner to have a Turkish bath and indoor swimming pool, but not long after her maiden voyage in 1907, she was already being outperformed by one of White Star Line's competitors, the Cunard Line. Now that German ships were becoming more dominant and White Star Line was owned by an American company, the Cunard Line wanted to protect and restore British shipping superiority and were able to receive help from the British government in order to do so. The government helped subsidize Cunard's next 2 ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. Both ships were not only luxurious, but also well known for their speed. They each won the Blue Ribbon. The Mauretania held it for 20 years, from 1909 to 1929. White Star Line knew that their previous ships were not good enough, and they would need to build more in order to remain competitive. In 1907, Bruce Ismay and chairman of Harland & Wolff, William Peer, started to plan their next few ships, the Olympic class. Like White Star Line's previous ships, these ships would not be built for speed, but instead be designed to be the largest and most luxurious of their time. They were the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Construction of the Olympic began in December 1908, and the Titanic began being built a few months later. The ships were designed in part by naval architect Edward Wilding, Alexander Carlisle, and Thomas Andrews. Aside from the small differences, the ships were nearly identical. Olympic's maiden voyage took place in June 1911. When construction for the Titanic was complete, the ship surpassed the Olympic in size and was at the time the largest ship in the world. On the morning of April 2, 1912, Titanic began sea trials where she was declared seaworthy, then left Belfast for Southampton in preparation for her maiden voyage. The voyage began on April 10th when she left Southampton to sail to New York, stopping first in Cherbourg, France, and then Queenstown, Ireland to pick up more passengers. The Titanic had around 900 crew members on board. In command of the ship was Captain Edward Smith, who was experienced and had a long and successful career at sea. He had been with White Star Line since 1880, where he had been captain of many of their ships, including the Majestic, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Olympic. Regarding the Adriatic, Smith was reported to have said in an interview, "Shipbuilding is such a perfect art nowadays that absolute disaster involving all the passengers is inconceivable. Whatever happens, there will be enough time before the vessel sinks to save the life of every person on board. I will go a bit further. I will say that I cannot imagine any condition that would cause the vessel to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that." The Titanic is widely known for being believed to be unsinkable. While it wasn't explicitly marketed as being impossible to sink, there are a few publications and advertisements about the ship that had emphasized its safety features, including an article in Shipbuilder magazine from summer of 1911, which described the Titanic as being practically unsinkable. A promotional pamphlet from White Star Line describing the Olympic and Titanic said, "As far as it is possible to do so, these two wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable." Another description of the ship read, "Each door is held in the open position by a suitable friction clutch, which can be instantly released by means of a powerful magnet controlled from the captain's bridge, so that in the event of an accident, or at any time when it may be considered advisable, the captain can, by simply moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout the ship, practically making the vessel unsinkable." It should be noted that marketing a ship as being difficult to sink was not unique to the Titanic, as there were other ships marketed in a similar way. Despite this, many passengers aboard the ship seemed to believe Titanic was not able to sink. This is evidenced from examples like this quote from survivor Margaret Devaney, who said, "I took passage on the Titanic for I thought it would be a safe steamship, and I had heard it could not sink." Another passenger, Thomas Beatty, who did not survive, wrote in a letter a few days before the voyage, "We are changing ships and coming home in a new unsinkable boat." It would also seem White Star Line workers believed to some degree the ship wouldn't sink. When the Titanic was launched in May 1911, a White Star Line employee was reported to have said, "Not even God himself could sink this ship," when asked about it. Even on the morning after the sinking, when unconfirmed reports of the tragedy were beginning to spread, Vice President of the International Mercantile Marine Company, Philip Franklin, said, "There is no danger that Titanic will sink. The boat is unsinkable, and nothing but inconvenience will be suffered by the passengers." While these are some examples, the notion that everybody thought the ship was unsinkable has been slightly exaggerated in the many years following the sinking. Though it is obvious now Titanic wasn't unsinkable, it was still designed to be difficult to sink. One of her most important safety features were the 16 watertight compartments in the lower part of the ship. The idea was that in the event of an emergency, each compartment would be closed, preventing water from spreading into the other compartments and keeping the ship afloat. However, these compartments were not entirely watertight as they weren't closed at the top and also weren't tall enough. Making them taller would have reduced space inside and would have been an inconvenience to passengers. These things helped contribute to how the ship sank, which we'll go over in more detail later on in the video. The Titanic was also equipped with a wireless telegraph system from the Marconi Company, who also supplied Titanic with two of its employees, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, to operate the equipment. The system was one of the best around at the time, and not only allowed passengers to send and receive messages, but it also allowed the operators to communicate with other ships, which will later be extremely important during the sinking. The accommodations on the Titanic were some of the most comfortable and luxurious out of any of her competitors. Even second and third class was considerably better than other ships at the time. However, passengers were still segregated by class, as was common. Some rooms on the Titanic, there are no known photographs of them that exist, but there are photos from her sister ship, the Olympic, which are for the most part the same as they'd have looked on the Titanic. Third-class passengers were provided with meals, something that was rare at the time as most other ocean liners required they bring their own food. Many of these passengers were immigrants looking to start a new life in the United States. Third-class accommodations also tended to be located in parts of the ship that experienced some noise and vibrations due to their proximity to the engines. In addition to there only being 2 bathtubs for the over 700 people there, most third-class passengers had to share rooms with strangers, though the women and families were kept separate from the single men. Third-class facilities included a dining room, which was divided in half by one of the watertight bulkheads, as well as a smoking room that was for men only, and a general room where both men and women would be able to gather for entertainment and socializing. They would also be able to go outside on the poop deck. Second class was an improvement over third class and had significantly less passengers. Bedrooms in second class were bigger and had more features than third class, though many did not have private bathroom facilities still. A portion of second-class bedrooms were made to be converted into first-class facilities if demand required them to. Second class also had its own dining area, which, like third class, did not have private tables, instead having longer tables where passengers would often eat next to strangers. There was also a men's-only smoking room decorated in the style of Louis XVI, furnished with green leather seats, along with the library decorated in the architectural style of the Adam brothers that was equipped with a bookshelf where people could borrow from and also served as a place to relax and socialize. There was also a barbershop that sold souvenirs. According to some, second class on the Titanic was the equivalent of first class on most other ships back then. The Titanic's first-class facilities are its most well-known features. They were made to look more like an expensive hotel rather than an ocean liner. In addition to the standard rooms, first class also had a variety of even more expensive suites. These suites often consisted of separate bedrooms, walk-in wardrobes, private bathroom facilities, and were much more spacious than the other rooms. Rooms were decorated in a variety of styles, like Louis XV and XVI, Georgian, and Queen Anne. First-class passengers also had multiple dining options. In addition to the dining saloon, there was a separate restaurant operated by Italian restaurateur Luigi Gatti, as well as 2 cafes, the Veranda and Palm Court and the Café Parisien. First class also had a men's-only smoking room, which featured a bar that provided alcohol along with cigars and other tobacco products. This room was the only room that had a real fireplace. Above the fireplace was a painting of Plymouth Harbor by Norman Wilkinson. Other facilities included a lounge, a reading and writing room, and a reception room. There was also a barbershop, gymnasium, swimming pool, Turkish baths, and a squash court. First class also had the most outdoor deck space. A church service was also held on Sundays. One of the most famous features on the ship, the Grand Staircase, was one of 2 staircases in first class. The more famous of the 2 was at the entrance to different first-class rooms, such as the reception and dining areas. No photographs of it are known to exist, so the pictures of it you see are actually of the one on the Olympic, which is believed to be identical to the one that was on Titanic. The ceiling above the staircase was a glass dome that allowed natural light to come in during the day. On the wall at the landing was the Honor and Glory crowning time clock, and the bottom of the staircase was decorated with a cherub. Parts of the staircase were also decorated with pineapple finials. A first-class ticket would cost in today's money around $4,500, with the most expensive options costing more than $100,000 when adjusted for inflation. A second-class ticket would be around $1,800, and a third class would be about $1,000 in today's money. In total, there were around 324 passengers in first class, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class. There was an estimated 2,224 people on board, including the crew. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats, enough for 1,178 people at full capacity. Despite this being significantly less than the total number of people on board, this was more than enough to meet regulations at the time. The number of lifeboats a ship had was determined by its tonnage and not by the amount of passengers it could carry. It was also thought in the event of an emergency, the Titanic would stay afloat long enough for everybody to be safely transported to a rescuing ship and it was never anticipated that all the passengers and crew would have to evacuate all at once. The crew was also poorly trained and inexperienced in deploying lifeboats. An additional lifeboat drill was scheduled the morning before the ship sank, but was cancelled by Captain Smith for unknown reasons. Among the passengers on Titanic, there were many that were wealthy or notable during their time. From White Star Line, Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews went to accompany the ship on her maiden voyage. J.P. Morgan, the ship's owner, was scheduled to go but cancelled his trip shortly before. John Jacob Astor IV was the wealthiest passenger, worth an estimated $87 million, about $2 billion in today's money. Just some of the other wealthy passengers included Macy's co-owner Isidor Straus, businessman Benjamin Guggenheim, silent film actress Dorothy Gibson, socialite Margaret Brown, known later as the unsinkable Molly Brown, businessman Charles Melville Hayes, and fashion designer Lady Duff Gordon. In addition to J.P. Morgan, there were also well-known people that canceled their trip. Some examples of these are Hershey's chocolate founder Milton S. Hershey, businessmen Henry Clay Frick, and millionaire Alfred Egwene Vanderbilt, who would go on to die in the sinking of the Lusitania 3 years later. The Titanic also carried plenty of expensive cargo. Along with mail, a few of the most valuable things that were lost in the sinking are a jeweled copy of the Persian poetry book Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 1912 Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville automobile, 4 cases of opium, first edition essays by Francis Bacon, and La Carcassine al Bain, a neoclassical oil painting from 1814. Passenger Elizabeth Lines claimed to have overheard a conversation between Captain Smith and Bruce Ismay in the first-class reception room on the afternoon of April 13, 1912. She later testified she heard Ismay and Smith discussing how the voyage had been going so far and that they began to talk about the ship's speed. She recalls Ismay doing most of the talking and remembers him saying, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday." This testimony served as a catalyst for many stories of the Titanic, having Ismay pressuring the captain into going faster. However, even including this testimony, there doesn't appear to be much evidence the captain was pressured into doing anything. Ismay testified Titanic was not going anywhere near her top speed and denied giving orders about going faster, saying Titanic was scheduled to arrive in New York Wednesday morning, and that, quote, there was nothing to be gained by arriving at New York any earlier than that. He also added, the Titanic being a new ship, we were gradually working her up. When you bring out a new ship, you naturally do not start running her at full speed until you get everything working smoothly and satisfactorily down below. Titanic also wasn't designed for speed, and White Star Line had little interest in competing for speed records at this time. Throughout the day of the sinking, Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic received multiple warnings of icebergs from other ships. The first warning came from the RMS Coronia around 9 a.m. It read, Captain, Titanic, westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north from 49 to 51 west, April 12th. Compliments, Bar. Captain Smith received this message. In the afternoon, the Titanic received another warning, this time from the Baltic, that warned of icebergs and large quantities of field ice. Captain Smith, as well as Bruce Ismay, were made aware of the warning. Also around this time, Titanic was able to receive a message from the German ship SS America that reported passing 2 large icebergs. Later that day, a new course was set that took Titanic further south to avoid the ice. This still wouldn't be good enough, as due to weather conditions, ice was found unusually further south that year. Despite the warnings, the Titanic did not slow down, which according to most was common practice during the time, especially with the otherwise good weather that night. One passenger, Mahala Douglas, wrote in an affidavit, Sunday afternoon, Mr. Ismay, whom I know very slightly, passed me on the deck. He showed me in his brusque manner a Marconigram, saying, "We have just had news that we are in the icebergs." "Of course you will slow down," I said. "Oh no," he replied, "we will put on more boilers and get out of it." That evening, more warnings about icebergs were received, although most of them would not reach the captain or other members of the crew. This may have been due to various reasons, one being that the night before, the wireless equipment had not been working properly and the two operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had spent nearly 6 hours fixing it. This was actually against the Marconi Company's protocol, which said that in the event anything broke, they would have to wait until they got onto shore where it could be fixed by professionals. Had Phillips and Bride followed this protocol, it is likely many more people would have died. Once they got it working again, Phillips and Bride would have been much busier than normal because of the backlog of messages. Also, the two wireless operators worked for the Marconi Company, not White Star Line. Their main job was dealing with messages from passengers and weather reports where anything else from other ships not specifically addressed to the captain may not have been considered a priority. This technology was also new at the time and was not seen by everybody as a necessity. There were no regulations or rules for it, and some ships didn't have theirs kept on at all times. That evening, a little after 7 o'clock, Titanic was able to receive another iceberg warning, this time from the Californian. It was also around this time Captain Smith was attending a dinner party at the restaurant that was being held in his honor by first-class passengers George and Eleanor Widener. After a little before 9, he returned to the ship's bridge where he and Second Officer Charles Lightoller observed the weather conditions. The temperature that night was almost freezing, but the conditions were clear with no wind and no moon. Lightoller would later describe it, saying, "It was a beautiful night. There was not a cloud in the sky. The sea was apparently smooth and there was no wind, but at that time you could see the stars rising and setting with absolute distinctness. Had there been a little breeze, it would have made ice easier to spot as they'd be able to see the water breaking on it." Smith stayed there for about half an hour. Before leaving, he told Lightoller, "If it becomes at all doubtful, let me know at once. I will be just inside." The Titanic relied solely on the lookouts to avoid the ice. There were a total of 6 lookouts on the Titanic. That night, they were George Simmons and Archie Jewell from 8 to 10, and Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, who replaced them at 10. Shortly after the captain left, Lightoller warned them to keep a sharp lookout for ice, particularly small ice and growlers. The lookout's job was made harder due to the fact that they had no binoculars. The binoculars were kept in a locker in the crow's nest, and the key to this locker was not on board. It had been accidentally taken by David Blair, a sailor who was originally supposed to work on the Titanic but had been reassigned just before the voyage began and forgot to give it back. Frederick Fleet later testified that they would have seen the iceberg earlier and had enough time to get out of the way if they had had the binoculars, although some disagree, saying it wouldn't have made much of a difference as there were other factors that contributed more to the sinking. A little later, a message was received from the ship Mesaba that warned of seeing heavy pack ice and great number of large icebergs, also field ice, within its vicinity. In the many years since the sinking, there have been some conflicting reports as to what was done with this message and the importance of it. Regardless, it doesn't seem to have been passed on to anyone. At around 10 p.m., in addition to Fleet and Lee beginning their shift on the lookout, the ship's first officer, William Murdoch, relieved Charles Lightoller and replaced him for the night. About an hour later, the Californian, who had warned Titanic about ice earlier that evening and was nearby, sent another message saying they were stopped and surrounded by ice. Jack Phillips, who was the operator on duty, responded with, shut up, I am busy, I am working Cape Race." Cape Race being a wireless station in Cape Race, Newfoundland, Canada. Due to the Californian being relatively close to the Titanic, its wireless signal interrupted Phillips while he was in the middle of sending a message. As Cyril Evans, the wireless operator on the Californian, later explained, "When somebody is sending a message to somebody else, and you start to send at the same time, you jam him. He does not get his message. I was stronger than Cape Race, therefore my signals came in with a bang, and he could read me and he could not read Cape Race." A little after 11:30, the Californian turned off its radio, and Evans, the ship's only operator, went to bed. At 11:40, one of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet, called the bridge to report seeing an iceberg straight ahead. William Murdoch ordered the ship to be steered away, but it was too late. Titanic hit the iceberg on her starboard side below the waterline. Some passengers were able to feel the impact and came to the deck to see what had happened. Survivor Edith Russell would later say, As I got out onto the promenade deck, I saw a large gray, what looked to me like a building floating by, but that building kept bumping along the rail, and as it bumped, it sliced off bits of ice, which fell all over the deck. We just picked up the ice and started playing snowballs. We thought it was fun. We asked the officers if there was any danger, and they said, "Oh no, nothing at all, nothing at all, nothing at all. Just a mere nothing. We just hit an iceberg." At this point, many of the passengers and crew members were unaware of the severity of the situation, while many of the workers in the boiler rooms and lower parts of the ship were already in danger and trying to escape. Some were able to get out in time, but the majority of them could not. The collision had caused damage to the ship's hull and caused her to flood. Though the watertight compartments were closed, this didn't do anything to stop the sinking. As mentioned before, the ship had 16 watertight compartments. However, these compartments were not closed at the top and therefore not entirely watertight. As the first few compartments began to flood at the front, Titanic began to lean forward and was pulled below the waterline, which caused water to spill over into the other compartments. Today, many people believe that if the ship had had no compartments, it would have allowed water to spread out more instead of just staying towards the front, which would not have stopped Titanic from sinking, but would have allowed the ship to remain horizontal, slowing down the sinking process and allowing for more time for rescue ships to come. Titanic was designed to be able to float with 4 compartments flooded. Once it was realized at least 6 were filling with water, Thomas Andrews, who had inspected the damage along with the captain, predicted the ship only had about 2 hours before she sank. Crew members went throughout the ship to wake up passengers and tell them to get on the deck with their life jackets. Harold Bride was getting ready to replace Jack Phillips for the night when shortly after midnight, Captain Smith came in and ordered them to send distress signals. Among some of the first ships to receive Titanic's messages was the French ship La Provence, the Canadian ship Mount Temple, and the German ship the Frankfurt, but they were all too far to come. Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, also responded, but was also too far. Sometime around 12:25 a.m., the closest ship to respond, the Carpathia, received Titanic's distress message and began to head towards her. However, the Carpathia was about 4 hours away and wouldn't get there until Titanic had already sank. Phillips and Bride stayed and continued to send messages until around 2 a.m. when Captain Smith dismissed them of their duties. According to Bride, who survived, Phillips continued working for 10 to 15 minutes after they were dismissed. Jack Phillips, the Titanic's senior wireless operator, who had just turned 25 on April 11th, died in the sinking. The closest ship to the Titanic was the Californian, which was less than 20 miles away and could have reached her before she sank. Californian's wireless was turned off as the operator had gone to bed and never received any of the distress calls. Titanic had also begun firing distress rockets after unsuccessfully trying to get the ship's attention using Morse lamps. In total, Titanic fired around an estimated 8 rockets. The crew on the Californian was able to see the rockets, however, there was some confusion as to what they meant, although some crew members did think the ship they were seeing might be in trouble. The captain, Stanley Lord, who had been woken up, ordered them to try and communicate through the Morse lamp, but Titanic did not respond. Nobody thought to awaken the wireless operator, though as mentioned before, the technology was new at the time and wasn't seen by everybody as being that important. Also, the Californian didn't know the ship they were seeing was the Titanic, so they wouldn't have been sure it even had wireless. Charles Lightoller would later say of this, "Though her lights were plain to everybody on board the Titanic, she seemed to pay not the slightest heed either to our wireless calls or to the distress signals we were firing every minute. And what a chance her captain missed. He could have laid his ship right alongside the Titanic and taken practically every soul on board." The crew aboard the Californian watched as Titanic's lights gradually disappeared and she stopped firing rockets. At first, they thought the ship might have sailed away. Eventually, the wireless operator, Cyril Evans, was woken up and they were made aware of the Titanic's sinking by other ships over the wireless. The Californian arrived at the Titanic's location in the morning after the Carpathia, but by then, all they found was wreckage, so they continued their route to America. Also, soon after midnight, lifeboats began to be launched. The first one was lowered at 12:45 a.m. Much of the crew was not fully prepared for launching lifeboats, and at first, many of the passengers were reluctant to get in, believing they were safer on the Titanic than in the boat. An order had been given to put the women and children in first. Lightoller remembers, "I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, 'Shall I get the women and children away, sir?' He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat." Most of the lifeboats were not filled to their full capacity. Unlike Lightoller, William Murdoch, who was in charge of the lifeboats on the starboard side, allowed men to get into the boats if there were no more women and children waiting to get on. The only man Lightoller allowed onto the boat was first-class passenger Arthur Godfrey Peuchen, who had some experience at sea being a yachtsman. As one of the lifeboats was being lowered, the crew member in charge of it, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, called up to say he needed another seaman to manage the boat. After Peuchen volunteered to help, Captain Smith, who was nearby, suggested he go down into the ship and break the window to climb into the boat. Instead, Peuchen used the rope to climb down onto it. As lifeboats were first being launched, many passengers as well as some crew members did not believe the ship would sink and that the lifeboats were just a precaution. As the night went on, more people began to realize the danger they were in. Passenger Lily Mae Futrell remembered in her account of what happened, "There was real alarm shown on the faces of the officers now, and the boats were being filled hurriedly." One second-class passenger, Esther Hart, had reportedly been paranoid the entire voyage and stayed up each night fully dressed. She had heard the ship hit the iceberg and went up to the deck with her husband and 7-year-old daughter Eva shortly after. She was able to get on a lifeboat with her daughter, but her husband stayed behind and did not survive. Most of the men obeyed the women and children first order. Elizabeth Schutz provided an example of this, writing, "We left from the sun deck, 75 feet above the water. Mr. Case and Mr. Roebling, brave American men, saw us to the lifeboat, made no effort to save themselves, but stepped back on the deck. Later, they went to an honored grave." Lightoller would later say, "The men all refrained from asserting their strength and from crowding back the women and children. They could not have stood quieter if they had been in church." Although this was not true for all men, especially as the ship continued to sink. Passenger Annie Mae Stengel recounts, 4 men jumped into the lifeboat she was on as it was being lowered. Quote, "These men who jumped in struck me and a little child. I was rendered unconscious and 2 of my ribs were very badly dislocated." Some people claim to have seen Major Archibald Butt, a passenger on board that had served as an aide to Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft, stop men from entering the lifeboats. One witness claimed, "In one of the earlier boats, 50 women, it seemed, were about to be lowered, when a man, suddenly panic-stricken, ran to the stern of it. Major Butt shot one arm out, caught him by the back of the neck and jerked him backward like a pillow. His head cracked against a rail and he was stunned. 'Sorry,' said Major Butt, 'women will be attended to first or I'll break every damned bone in your body.'" Multiple witnesses claimed to have heard gunshots, some even claiming an officer shot himself. One example is from a letter written in the days after the sinking by first-class passenger George Rhymes, saying, "I saw an officer with a revolver fire a shot and kill a man who was trying to climb into it. As there remained nothing more to do, the officer told us, 'Gentlemen, each man for himself, goodbye.' He gave a military salute and then fired a bullet into his head." However, while testifying under oath in November 1913, Rhymes only mentions hearing 2 pistol shots and doesn't say anything about what he saw. Another testimony from passenger Hugh Woolner reports seeing 2 pistol shots, although he says they were warning shots fired into the air because a group of men had swarmed one of the boats, preventing women from getting on. It is unknown who this officer was. Some people seem to think it may have been William Murdoch, although it is not confirmed since there are conflicting reports as to what he was last seen doing. The 1997 film depicts this being Murdoch, but the filmmakers later apologized. Aside from different eyewitness testimonies, there is no other evidence that exists, as Murdoch's body, or any body with gunshot wounds, was never recovered, so whatever really happened will most likely never be known. One of the few surviving officers, Harold Lowe, testified that he fired his gun but claimed they were warning shots and he didn't kill anyone. There are several accounts that say people were shot. One survivor, mess steward Cecil William Fitzpatrick, said in his account, "As one of the lifeboats was being filled with women and children, a foreigner tried to jump onto the boat. The officer told him to go on deck. He refused, and the officer fired and the man fell dead on deck. The lifeboat was lowered, and the officer kept on firing his revolver till he was level with the water." I saw a similar instance on the port side. A passenger tried to claim a seat in one of the boats. The officer told him to leave at once, and as he hesitated, a revolver shot was fired and he dropped dead in the water. Fitzpatrick was never called to give evidence at any of the inquiries. Despite the witnesses, this too will most likely remain unconfirmed. Some women were unwilling to enter the lifeboats without their husbands. Eloise Smith wrote that she went up to Captain Smith and asked him if her husband could come with her, but Smith ignored her and continued shouting through his megaphone, "Women and children first." She says her husband, Lucian P. Smith, came and said, "Never mind, Captain, about that. I will see that she gets in the boat." Then told her, "I never expected to ask you to obey, but this is one time you must. It is only a matter of form to have women and children first. The boat is thoroughly equipped, and everyone on her will be saved." Lucian Smith did not survive. Eloise also wrote, "Still, I had not the least suspicion of the scarcity of lifeboats, or I never should have left my husband." Macy's co-owner, Isidore Strauss, and his wife Ida were at one point offered spots on a lifeboat. Isidore refused to go before the other men, and Ida did not want to leave without him. They both stayed on board and died when the ship sank. The ship's wealthiest passenger, John Jacob Astor IV, did not survive. His body was later found carrying some of his belongings, including $2,440, a very large amount of money, especially at the time. His pregnant wife survived and gave birth to John Jacob Astor V within the following months. Another wealthy passenger who did not survive, Benjamin Guggenheim, reportedly got dressed in his best evening wear along with his valet and was heard to have said, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." It has often been portrayed in films that third-class passengers were locked in and prevented from getting to the deck. This is not entirely true. Gates that were locked were done so in accordance with U.S. immigration law. At the time, it was required for third-class passengers to remain separated from everyone else in order to prevent the spread of diseases. A reason many third-class passengers did not survive was a lot of them did not speak English, and as a result had a harder time trying to navigate their way around the ship, and third class was located further away from the lifeboats than first and second. Some third-class men were also prevented from accessing the deck due to the women and children first rule. Some of the gates were guarded at first to prevent people from rushing the lifeboats all at once, but they were reportedly fully opened by around 12:30 before the first lifeboat was launched. One third-class passenger who survived, Daniel Buckley, would later say that they had as much of a chance as the other classes, but that some crew members did guard the gates at one point. There was one steerage passenger there, and he was getting up the steps, and just as he was going in a little gate, a fellow came along and chucked him down, threw him down into the steerage place. Third-class steward John Edward Hart testified that the women and children were given an equal opportunity to leave, but some did not want to. Quote, "Yes, those that were willing to go to the boat deck were shown the way. Some were not willing to go to the boat deck and stayed behind. Some of them went to the boat deck and found it rather cold and saw the boats being lowered away and thought themselves more secure on the ship and consequently returned to their cabin. Those who stayed behind gathered to pray, or some stayed in their room." Fifth Officer Harold Lowe also testified none of the women and children were denied access to a lifeboat once they were on the deck, saying, "The first woman was first into the boat, and the second woman was second into the boat, no matter whether she was a first-class passenger or any other class." Thomas Andrews, who did not survive, assisted passengers during the sinking, even throwing things like chairs off the ship so that they could be used as flotation devices. He was reportedly last seen by a steward in the first-class smoking room, staring at the painting of Plymouth Harbor. While he most likely did spend some time in the smoking room, whether this was the last thing he did is disputed. Some accounts say he went back up to the deck and was last seen at the bridge with Captain Smith. There are many conflicting reports as to what Captain Smith was last seen doing. Some claimed that he had shot himself, which is most likely not true. More credible reports say that he was last seen at the bridge, and some even said they saw him swimming. Whatever really happened to him will probably never be known. Bruce Ismay got on a lifeboat shortly before the ship sank. His decision to do this was subject to heavy criticism and led him to be branded as a coward and sometimes referred to as J. Brute Ismay. Much of the negative press Ismay received was in part due to Ismay's relationship with newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst. Hearst and Ismay did not like each other, and following the Titanic's sinking, Hearst's newspapers all ran stories that portrayed Ismay negatively. This is what led to Ismay being consistently portrayed as the villain in most Titanic films and adaptations. In reality, Ismay had assisted with helping passengers into the lifeboats and only got into a boat with another male passenger towards the end when they were both sure no other women and children were waiting to get on. The British Inquiry defended Ismay's actions, saying, Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found sea collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side actually being lowered. No other people were there at the time, there was room for him and he jumped in. Had he not jumped in, he would simply have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost. The ship's band had gathered in the first-class lounge to play music to help calm the passengers. They eventually moved to the deck, where they continued to play until the ship sank. It has been reported that the final song they played was the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. However, some people dispute this, saying they instead continued to play happier songs to help calm the passengers. All of the band members died in the sinking. Titanic also had a mailroom. When that began to flood, the postal workers tried to save the mail, but it wasn't any use. The ship's engineers continued working throughout the sinking to keep the lights on until the final moments. None of them survived. The grand staircase was one of the final parts to flood. A replica of the staircase was built for the 1997 film. When it was purposely flooded during filming, the staircase broke off and floated away. It is thought this could have been what happened to the real staircase as well. Towards the end, the stern began to be pulled further into the air as the bow continued to sink into the water. One of the funnels came crashing down, crushing everybody who was in its path. Around the same time the lights went out, the ship split in two. This was a matter of debate in the years following the sinking, but was confirmed to have happened when the wreck was discovered around 70 years later. As the bow split off and sank, the stern stayed floating for about 5 more minutes in a vertical position before sinking into the water. Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley watched the ship sink from the lifeboats. He later wrote of what he saw. When the noise was over, the Titanic was still upright like a column. We could see her now only as the stern, and some 150 feet of her stood outlined against the star-specked sky, looming black in the darkness. And in this position, she continued for some minutes. I think as much as 5 minutes, but it may have been less. Then, first sinking back a little at the stern, I thought, she slid slowly forwards through the water and dived slantingly down. The sea closed over her, and we had seen the last of the beautiful ship on which we had embarked 4 days before at Southampton. The Titanic was completely gone by 2:20 a.m., around 2 hours and 40 minutes after she hit the iceberg. With the ship gone, those in the lifeboats were able to hear the screams of those who were now in the water. Many people would die within minutes from the freezing temperatures. A few boats did go back to rescue people, but only after waiting a little bit. Robert Hitchens, who was in charge of lifeboat number 6, was very adamant about not going back to pick up more passengers. Some of the passengers on this boat were Arthur Godfrey Peuchen and Lois Smith and Molly Brown. Many of the women on board wanted to go back and would later speak very negatively about Hitchens. Most of the lifeboats did not go back. The majority of the people who didn't make it to a boat died, and there were very few rescued from the water. One of the few saved was the ship's chief baker, Charles Joggin, who had been in the water for almost 2.5 hours before being picked up by a lifeboat. Before the ship sank, Joggin had gotten drunk, which some credit with helping him last longer in the cold water. When the Carpathia arrived around 4 a.m., all they found was wreckage and the survivors in the lifeboats. They would spend the next few hours picking up the survivors and eventually got to New York on April 18th. Survivors were reportedly well taken care of by the ship's crew. Around 1,500 people died in the sinking, leaving about 700 survivors. While on board the Carpathia, Bruce Ismay sent a message to the offices in New York. It read, "Deeply regret to advise you, Titanic sank this morning after collision with iceberg, resulting in serious loss of life. Full particulars later, Ismay." Shortly after the Carpathia arrived in New York City, the full scale of the disaster began to be made known to the public. During this time, several ships went to the site of the sinking to recover bodies. Of the bodies recovered, some were buried at sea, some were claimed by family members, and some were buried at cemeteries on land, notably in places like Halifax, Canada. Only around 300 bodies were ever recovered. Most of the public was shocked to hear the Titanic had sank and demanded answers. Both the British and American governments conducted inquiries into what had happened. Both of the inquiries came to similar conclusions, among those being that there weren't enough lifeboats and that the crew was not properly prepared for using them, and that despite the iceberg warnings, the ship did not slow down. It was also determined that while third class wasn't actively prevented from accessing the lifeboats, they were still at a disadvantage. The American inquiry was critical of the regulations and the British Board of Trade, saying, "We shall leave to the honest judgment of England its painstaking chastisement of the British Board of Trade, to whose laxity of regulation and hasty inspection the world is largely indebted for this awful fatality. Of contributing causes there were very many." While the inquiry praised Captain Smith's actions during the sinking, it also criticized him, saying, "His indifference to danger was one of the direct and contributing causes of this unnecessary tragedy, and those of us who knew him well, not in anger, but in sorrow, file one specific charge against him: overconfidence and neglect to heed the oft-repeated warnings of his friends." The British inquiry didn't place any blame on him, saying, "In these circumstances, I am not able to blame Captain Smith. He had not the experience which his own misfortune had awarded to those whom he has left behind, and that he was only doing that which other skilled men would have done in the same position." The report also added how people should learn from this sinking, saying, "What was a mistake in the case of the Titanic would without a doubt be negligence in any similar case in the future." Senator William Alden Smith, who led the U.S. inquiry, also said in his speech that Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews being on board may have influenced the speed of the ship, although there was no evidence to suggest either of them ordered it directly. The British inquiry disagreed with this, saying, "The evidence shows that he was not trying to make any record passage, or indeed any exceptionally quick passage. He was not trying to please anybody, but was exercising his own discretion in the way he thought best." Both of the inquiries heavily criticized the actions of Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian for failing to help. It was agreed current regulations were outdated and needed to be changed. Ships would now be required to have enough lifeboats for every passenger on board, with mandatory drills. They would also need to have a wireless operator on duty for all 24 hours in a day, and that ships should only fire rockets while in distress, so when they are seen, there is no confusion as to what they are for. It was also made aware they should slow down when traveling through areas with ice reported. Design changes were also made in ships, notably making the watertight bulkheads taller so that they'd be fully watertight and water wouldn't be able to pour into the other compartments. Titanic's sister ships were among the many ships that underwent changes for improved safety. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was founded to monitor and report icebergs to ships in the North Atlantic. It still exists today. Hundreds of survivors and those impacted by the sinking filed claims against White Star Line. Damage had been done to the company's reputation, but they continued to operate successfully for years after. Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, continued to be in service until 1935, while her other sister ship, Britannic, was sunk during World War I in 1916 after only being in service for a little over a year. Bruce Ismay resigned from White Star Line and left the International Mercantile Marine Company in 1913. While he was cleared of any wrongdoing in the inquiries, this did not change public opinion about him, and he stayed out of the public eye for the remainder of his life. Ismay would never fully recover from the Titanic. Still, he remained active in business, helping to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for insurance claims to Titanic survivors and donating money to charities. He died in 1937. Following financial difficulties, White Star Line eventually merged with the Cunard Line in 1934 to form Cunard White Star Line. This lasted until 1949, when Cunard bought White Star Line's share of the company and reverted back to just Cunard Line. There has been some interest in finding and possibly salvaging the Titanic ever since it sank. However, most of these plans were abandoned due to being expensive and technology not being advanced enough. By 1953, one of the first serious attempts was made by the salvage company Ridson Beasley. Throughout the next few decades, more attempts will be made by various different companies and people, although none would be successful. There have been many proposals on how to salvage it, but most were impractical. After many failed expeditions, the wreck of the Titanic was discovered by Robert Ballard in 1985. Since then, thousands of artifacts have been recovered, though many people, including some survivors, were against this, saying the Titanic is a grave and should be treated respectfully. In 1998, a large piece of the ship's hull was recovered and is currently on display in Las Vegas. The wreck is deteriorating, and it is estimated it will one day completely decay and soon disappear. The last Titanic survivor, Melvina Dean, who was aboard the Titanic when she was a baby, died in 2009. Ever since the Titanic sank in 1912, it has been the subject of public interest to some degree. Many first-person accounts of the sinking were published in newspapers and books that became popular. Over the years, the Titanic inspired many books, music, poems, and films which have enabled it to continue to remain well known. The first film about the ship was called Saved from the Titanic and was released in 1912, a little over a month after the sinking, and starred an actual survivor, Dorothy Gibson, who wore in the film the same clothes she wore while she was on the real Titanic. This film is considered lost as the footage was destroyed in a fire in 1914. Only a few pictures from it remain. One of the next notable films about the ship was released in Germany in 1943. The movie, called Titanic, was commissioned by Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and was one of the first Titanic films to feature fictionalized characters and stories. The film was intended to portray the British negatively and features a fictional German officer on board as the hero. It was not shown in Germany due to the ongoing war. Goebbels decided it would be better to show more uplifting films to the German public. However, it was shown in other parts of Europe. Another movie called Titanic was released in America in 1953. A Night to Remember, released in 1958 and based on the book of the same name, is widely regarded as the most historically accurate film depicting the sinking. In 1997, another movie called Titanic was released. It was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time and went on to become one of the world's highest-grossing films. Since 1912, there have been many different films and documentaries on the subject, the ones previously mentioned being the most notable of them all. Well, that was almost everything there is to know about the Titanic. If you made it this far into the video, just want to say thanks for watching. More videos should be coming out soon. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in another video. This has been the Friendly Neighborhood Pig.